Hey guys, Alex here. Now that we've covered some mid-game and end-game technical maneuvers, I would like to then cover some mid-game techniques. So, some of these standard mid-game techniques are actually fixed sequences in terms of handling a certain situation. So, even though you may not be able to see the benefit up front, you would actually have to learn that the treatment of that shape is actually going to benefit you in the long run. So, with that in mind, let's talk about mid-game techniques. Hey everyone, so today we're going to be talking about mid-game techniques part 1. So earlier in episode 4, we actually talked briefly about quiet moves, and over the course of all the previous episodes, we briefly touched on what exactly constitutes, in general, a good or an acceptable move, or at least something that is not too terrible. So if I compare that into maybe going into a fight with somebody, it would just be teaching you a very basic punch or kick. As we move deeper into the game, what we really need to know is some short sequences or mid-game techniques that would actually play out in your favor, or just certain maneuvers that you can play that is generally in favor of your position or shape. Even though you may not be able to see the impact of it profoundly or leading up to the end game, but it's important to actually keep at least a basic tempo or within a shape that is still playable. So some of the mid-game techniques that I'm going to cover in the next 4 episodes is going to be all about preserving tempo and also maintaining a shape that is still within a playable region. If I were to compare looking deeper into the game and seeing a few more moves ahead, it would just be like performing a combo instead of a light punch. Like so. With that in mind, let's talk about the first mid-game technique today. So today's topics are going to be about 3 mid-game techniques: post and twist, post and cross, post and feed. So let's talk about post and twist first. So let's take a look at this situation over here. So over here, it's now black's turn to play, and there doesn't seem to be many obvious moves or good moves for black to actually play, even though the situation is actually quite even in terms of the rating. So over here, you would then observe and consider all of black's moves. If black were to play c8, flips 3 discs in 2 different directions, gives white a very simple d8. That's not too favorable. If black were to consider playing d8, that's flipping 5 discs in 3 different directions, which is also not too favorable. And also, in terms of f8, it might be slightly better because white does not have direct access to cut back into d8, but it's still not as favorable to play this. So if you consider this entire shape to the top, for black, to play either c2 or f2 would also be flipping this in 2 directions, as well as d2 would be flipping 3 discs in 3 different directions. So in general, we tend to want to make moves that flip this in only one direction. So let's take a look at e2, which is the only move in general that seems to be acceptable that flips this in one direction. Of course, b8 and g2 are also moves that actually flip this in one direction. However, they are either c square or an x square, which is not too favorable to play, at least in the earlier stage of the game. So let's consider e2. So e2, you might argue that e2 gives up a very simple d2, so it's almost like just feeding white a very good move to centralize. However, we want to, as we advance further into the game, we want to consider sequences instead of just singular moves or just moves that look superficially good, at least on maybe 1 to 2 moves ahead. So the strength of e2 is to actually conduct this mid-game technique that I like to call post and twist. Usually, my brother and I like to refer it to dancing around. So let's take a look at the sequence. So it's a very simple 3-move sequence where black places an e2 disc, posts up at e2, give up the feed to d2, which is an obvious move for white to make, and then followed by black rotating to actually g4. So how is this maneuver actually good and ensures the shape is playable for black? In essence, in doing so, even though black gave white a very nice move in terms of the centralizing move to d2, however, black twists across to g4 and makes f2 actually a very unfavorable move. So that ensures that black still remains somewhat in the center and still has an additional move to f2, which is badly poisoned after black has played g4 and converted the f3 disc to black. So if white would play f2, white would essentially flip the entire row of discs. So the standard sequence might be for white to continue on to f1 perhaps, or maybe to consider g3. So if white were to go to f1, black could either consider f2 or maybe even c2 just to centralize, which is flipping this in two different directions, but still fairly nestled. The disk that you're flipping is still fairly nestled within the existing disk, so you don't really create more moves for your opponent. Or f1 simply just to centralize. And of course, if white were to choose to play maybe g3, black could just go into f2 and centralize. So that essentially is a post and twist. So if we go over the sequence, it's sort of like going against this entire row of this entire column of white discs, which could potentially be a telltale sign of white's vulnerability of this particular shape. So in Othello, usually you have a very obvious move, a good move to play, or you have to carve out your own move by playing indirect sequences, maybe just looking 2 or 3 moves ahead, or maybe more. So as you advance into the later stage and try to move on from an intermediate player to an advanced player, what you really need to consider in order to play good Othello is to look ahead and consider more profound sequences. So let's recap: e2, d2, followed by that rotation down to g4. So that's more like a post and twist maneuver. So it's more like black went down to e2, flipped some disc along this direction, and then flipped over or twist over to g4 and created a poison position for white in order to continue to have a nice move to f2 and basically to continue playing in the game or staying in the game. So let's now move on to the next mid-game technique. So now let's talk about post and cross. So earlier we talked about post and twist. Now we want to talk about a mid-game situation whereby you can do a post up, feed the move, and then cross across to the other side. So over here in this particular shape, it's quite a fixed sequence from Taminori opening and just a side variation perhaps. And usually the book move for white to just continue is to simply just cross over to d7, which can also be considered as a post and cross of some sorts. But in this case, it's really more on just a direct cross down to d7, and black can perhaps play to b6, and white would then just cross over to b4 and sort of have the ultimate say in a 1-2 punch kind of cross sequence. So that is somewhat of a post and cross, with the exception that the first move is a direct cross. So something that is more similar to a post and cross, I would say, would be a move such as f3, which is also still playable. So when white plays f3, black will just go in for the obvious feat, which is a great centralizing move, flipping only one disc in one direction, and the disc that he flips is surrounded by the existing disc. So he doesn't really create many more moves for his opponent. However, after black plays to f4, white could then perform e8, which is a cross across the entire group of discs. So even though this cross flips 4 discs, as many as 4 discs, this entire block of black discs that white chooses to flip is within a column within the center of the whole block of discs. So white essentially doesn't really create many more moves for black. So with white playing down to e8, if black were to play to b6, white then gains one more centralizing move to d7. So the strength of this particular move is that it poisons the move to d7 as well. So even if black wanted to snatch d7 from white, black is not able to do so. And with the d3 disc and the d5 disc that contributes to white's access to d7, there isn't any way for black to actually prevent white from capturing d7. So it presents more of like a dilemma to black on whether to guard d7 or whether to just ignore it. If he ignores it, white simply just goes in for a very easy nestled center shape. And of course, if black were to choose to defend it, he would be flipping two discs in two different directions, and still white gets somewhat of a centralization, although it's a potential balanceable and also unbalanceable edge based on where black chooses to advance along the edge. However, this general shape is somewhat balanced and also slightly in favor of white, perhaps to control the center position. So usually in a situation like this, it gives black a tough choice to actually decide where to play. So this sort of maneuver could be favorable, and also in terms of presenting choices for your opponent to make some mistakes perhaps. So let's go over the sequence again. So white playing f3 gives up the direct response to black, which is the general tendency for players to actually play. And then white uses the e3 disc and basically just crosses down across the entire group of discs, and then try to capture the centralized position. So let's now talk about post and feed. So this is a much simpler mid-game technique as compared to the other two, perhaps, if you will, but it's also an important note to actually realize, what to play and what not to play. So over here in this position, white is actually slightly ahead, but it's finding a little bit of difficulty just trying to continue the sequence, perhaps. So over here, after black has played f8, it opens up a possible sequence for white to jump in to d8. However, right now, white doesn't have a direct access to access that move. So going too straightforward towards g5 creates an opportunity for black to essentially just defend it. And you can't really play h5 to establish that access back, even though it does create an irremovable g5 for you. It's way too poisoned in a sense that it flips two more discs along the diagonal that would essentially create a lot more moves for black along the edge. And if you lose the tempo along the edge, you would eventually lose the game very quickly. So this is something we want to avoid. Of course, you might argue that white could jump in to h6 and then go for that access. However, if white were to do that, black would probably be able to just form up a pair in terms of that unbalanced edge, or just simply cover it. But in this case, black wouldn't really want to cover it because these two discs at d7 and e8 are important poison discs for white's a4. So if black were to play d8 and flip all three discs in three different directions, white would essentially have a very simple move, a quiet move at that, to play a4 and maybe consecutively to a5 as well, and white would be able to gain tempo. So black would then have to play b8, and if white wanted to continue that sequence, whether white chooses to play c8 followed by black responding to d8, or white going to d8 and black responding to c8, white would still have at least one disc along this mini diagonal that would still keep a poison for white. So let's take a look at the post and feed maneuver. So instead of going head first or going too direct an approach to g5 in order to find that access to d8, what white should actually do right now is to either take the edge at g8 and just wait, or perform what I like to call a post and feed, or a feed and straight if you like. So over here, in order to play this move, you need to first identify and tell yourself and convince yourself that the bottom situation is more of a passive kind of shape whereby you don't really need to touch it because you don't really have any active moves as well. But at the same time, if black were to make one more move to the bottom, any one of them, it would be in your favor, because if black were to just close up over here to d8 in the future, white would then be able to open up and play a4, which is a very nice quiet move. Or if black were to just form an unbalanced edge, white could then continue to just feed off that unbalanced edge to c8, d8, and then this would be a solid 5 this unbalanced where white can look to feed off the corner to H8 and then wedge in between the G8 and wrap up the disc to the clockwise direction and from the bottom to the left hand side. So over here, in order to perform the post and feed maneuver and just keep to your side and keep the lower shape untouched, white can then be able to play G3. So G3 is a bit odd in a sense that you feed your opponent one move to G4, which is a quiet move and also a very simple move for black. So generally it's counterintuitive to do that. However, in order to maintain the top shape, that is a passive shape for white, waiting for black to just break through to the top or the bottom to create moves for yourself, what you need to do to maintain that shape is perhaps to play G3, feed off G4, and then extend H4. So it's more like you post up at G3, you feed off G4, and you play a straight move down while black does not have any access to the right region. Black would then be forced to either commit to the bottom, that you'll be able to create more moves for yourself and also a shape for you, or black would then be forced to perhaps play D2, which functions as a point disc to point down to G5 in order to regroup in a very compact manner within the entire group of discs. So that, in essence, is the post and feed mid-game technique, which is very important for you to discern between doing something like this, which is a very good sequence, versus or opposed to actually taking G5, which is a too direct approach, which is totally preventable by your opponent, and that will result in a shape that is not as good for you to continue on the game. So with that, I'd like to close off this episode with the first 3 mid-game techniques, and definitely within the next few episodes we'll be talking about different mid-game patterns and techniques. So even though it's not possible to provide you with an exhaustive list of all the patterns or all the mid-game techniques that you can execute, I will try my best to actually illustrate at least one of each major type of mid-game techniques that you can perhaps play in order to continue that position. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next episode.